Good afternoon. Thank you for being with us today. It's a special day, I would say. I mean, for us at the Institute of International Relations and the Council for Foreign Relations, this is a joint activity that we very much appreciate. Always when we join forces, I think the outcome is always very good. And we have a special guest tonight. And thank you for your time and presence here. Andrew Novo is a good friend, but above all is a very good scholar of the topic he is going to talk about, which is a topic that I am the less knowledgeable about from the panel. We have very distinguished commentators here, Professor Papastoteriou, Konstantina Botsiou, Professor Platias, to comment on what Andrew will present on a topic that seems so old, but it's also so new, especially now that we are talking again about great power competition. The lessons are always useful, so we are waiting with, I would say, with a lot of interest to listen to what you have to say about alliances and decisions. I mean, having in mind that the most sustainable alliance of the world ever, NATO, can be under threat in a couple of months. So anyway, Andrew, you have the floor. We are looking forward to what you have to say and then to the comments of our colleagues. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you very much, It's a pleasure to be here in Athens. A pleasure to be at the Institute of International Relations. I'm grateful to Professor Platias and Thucydides for the invitation to speak with you all today and share some thoughts about Professor Platias's favorite author, the Athenian historian Thucydides. Thucydides, of course, is one of my favorite authors as well. His book remains an invaluable teaching tool and resource for how we think about politics, strategy, and international affairs, among a host of other topics we could add. How we used Thucydides' work to teach and to think was the starting point of my book, Restoring Thucydides, Testing Familiar Lessons and Deriving New Ones, which I published with my colleague, Dr. Jay Parker, in 2020, directly to coincide with COVID, which curtailed our book tour a little bit. In that book, our goal, as the title suggests, was to challenge readers as they engage with Thucydides. We wanted to present ways of thinking beyond the paraphrases, aphorisms, and maxims by reading Thucydides' book as a whole and by combining it with the broader historical and intellectual context of the Hellenic world. In today's talk, I'm going to focus on the theme of allies, using 3 episodes from Thucydides' history. In the book, we address aspects of these episodes in detail, but alliances per se were not our focal point. In that sense, my presentation is both a recapitulation of material in the book, but also an extension of it. And so I would like to explore what Thucydides' history can tell us about the functioning of alliances and whether there are broader lessons regarding alliance politics that we can derive. So with that in mind, I look forward to your comments and suggestions on how I can improve on and refine these ideas. Thucydides' book offers a great deal of thought-provoking material about alliances. His account makes us consider whether states support their allies because of selfish fears of abandonment, a genuine convergence of interests, or simply as an excuse to further their own aggrandizement. We might answer these questions with the obvious response that states do all these things, depending on circumstances, or their leaders, or their perceived interests. In examining Thucydides, however, we can try to push deeper and think more comprehensively about these issues. What makes allies fear abandonment? can fear cut both ways, in the sense that both the more powerful and less powerful parties in an alliance fear abandonment? What are the dangerous impacts of abandonment that allies are trying to avoid? When we think of converging interests, who defines those interests? And what interests involving allies are worth the risk of war? How do states manipulate circumstances to further their greatness? And do they need to manipulate public opinion, or is the naked appeal to aggrandizement sufficient? Using the lens of alliances, we might be able to gain a deeper understanding of Thucydides' work while developing a more general idea about how alliances work with implications for our own time. Through an exploration of alliances, we might also better understand larger questions in international politics, how a state defines its interests, what we mean by power, and what causes fear. The first inflection point I would like to explore is the Spartan decision for war against Athens in 432, spurred by the pressure of Sparta's ally, Corinth. After the decisions that led to the breakdown of the Peace of Nicias, particularly the breakdown of Sparta's alliances with the Peloponnesian War and the temporary realignment of Corinth with Athens, that's the second point. And finally, we can consider the Athenian decision-making behind their expedition to Sicily in 415, which at the time was presented as a response to the request of Athens's Sicilian allies. So to begin, in a book filled with famous speeches, the speech of the Spartan ephor Sthenelaidas before the Spartan assembly in 432 stands out for its brevity. We may debate its rhetorical power, its accuracy, or even its authenticity, but its effectiveness in pushing Sparta toward war with Athens appears convincing. Sthenelaidas' focus in the heart of Book 1 is to convince the Spartan assembly that Athens has violated the terms of its treaty with Sparta and to begin Spartan military action against Athens. In his speech, the position of Sparta's allies is critical to his argument about the necessity of confronting Athens. We have good allies, he insists, whom we must not give up to the Athenians. His brief speech mentions allies multiple times. He refers to them as a source of Spartan strength to convince his listeners that those allies will help Sparta to achieve victory during the war. He highlights the vulnerability of Sparta's allies to Athenian aggression, and he warns that they should not be, quote, left to ruin. The ephore's speech is an important data point in Thucydides' overarching argument that the cause of the war was Spartan fear of the growth of Athenian power. Sthenelaidas' emphasis on Sparta's alliances forces us to consider how much of Spartan fears were directed toward Athenian undermining of its alliances and how Athenian power threatened to erode Sparta's ability to exercise hegemonial power within the Peloponnesian League. Implicitly, I think, we understand that Sparta's allies, particularly Corinth, a major economic and naval power in its own right, were a source of Spartan power. In speaking of allies, Sthenelaidas indirectly echoes the concerns of the Corinthians who spoke at the assembly before the Spartan leaders. In their speech, the Corinthian ambassadors focus on their grievances on the Athenian siege of Potidaia. Potidaia, of course, was a Corinthian colony, but a member of the Athenian Delian League, which put it in a very awkward position. Athens, wary of a broader revolt among its tributary states in the north, which they were afraid would be supported by Macedonia, demanded that Potidaia demolish its walls and provide hostages. Potidaia refused. Moreover, they secured a Spartan promise to invade Attica in the event of an Athenian attack. Potidaia did revolt, and the Athenian army marched to the north to lay siege to the town. Corinth responded in an unorthodox way, dispatching a force of mercenaries and volunteers to avoid openly bringing their state into conflict with Athens. As Thucydides records, there was still a truce for this was a private enterprise on the part of Corinth. These were, if you will, the little green men of the 5th century BC. At the subsequent assembly of the Peloponnesian League, a long list of grievances was presented against Athens. Last to speak among the allies was Corinth, whose emissaries used their speech to spur Sparta to war. Their culminating argument revolved around alliances, but with an interesting double message. First, as might be expected from a less powerful partner, they urged the Spartans not to, quote, sacrifice them to the Athenians. But second, they played a more assertive card, threatening that they would defect from the Peloponnesian League. Do not drive us in despair to some other alliance, they warned, before doubling down on their threat with the warning that a Spartan desertion would compel them to seek new relations. How credible was Corinth's threat to defect? And was such a defection something Sparta needed to fear? Well, allies can and do make threats to seek new relations, sometimes explicitly, sometimes less explicitly. Sometimes they even follow through on these threats. There is no standard of absolute fidelity in international affairs. But such changes are rare. During the Cold War, for example, no country switched allegiance from NATO to the Warsaw Pact, although we see that since the collapse of the Soviet Union, many Warsaw Pact nations have joined NATO. Nevertheless, alliances can be surprisingly dynamic. For example, the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany concluded the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact and attacked Poland together. Hitler obviously broke that pact in 1941 when he ordered the invasion of the Soviet Union. Italy did not join the war in 1939, but delayed entry on the Axis side until 1940. In July 1943, the Italian Fascist Party actually overthrew Mussolini, and in September, concluded a separate peace with the Allies and became co-belligerents with the Allies. Romania also switched from the Axis to the Allied side in August 1944. Corinth did eventually pull away from Sparta when it concluded its own alliance with Athens following the Peace of Nicias, as we'll discuss in detail later. Corinth also sought an alliance with Argos in an attempt to overthrow Spartan dominion of the Peloponnese. If we extend our inquiry beyond Thucydides' work, we see that after the end of the Peloponnesian War, Corinth, supported by Persia, allied with Thebes and Athens to overthrow Sparta's hegemony. Such examples, I think, support the notion that Corinthian threats to defect were credible. But how significant were they for Sparta? So in the book, we develop the argument that Sparta's unique political system and concomitant social vulnerabilities, demographic realities, economic and military limitations meant that Corinth's defection would have been extremely damaging. Here we can highlight a few key points. First, after Athens, Corinth had the second largest navy in the Greek world, and we know that it was also a highly effective force. Sparta, at the outbreak of war, had no naval forces to speak of. Sparta had a small population of citizens relative to its rival. Corinth had the second largest population of any polis in the Greek world, second only to Athens. Its economy was powerful, again, second probably only to Athens. Sparta's economy in terms of trade and finance was negligible. Sparta's ability to project power beyond the Peloponnese had other limitations. Sending troops beyond the peninsula without the cooperation of Corinth, since Corinth controlled the isthmus, would have been extremely difficult. Finally, Spartan troops could never leave home for too long. The longest incursion into Attica, for example, during the war lasted 40 days because of the fear of Helot revolt at home. These are factors that the Spartan assembly would have understood very well. They placed limits, real limits, on Spartan power and helped shape our understanding of the precise nature of Spartan fear, particularly in relation to the threat of Corinthian defection. In the bigger picture, the discussion before the Spartan assembly illustrates the centrality of allies to Sparta's foreign policy, particularly its close relationship with Corinth. It also highlights the principle that an ally has the ability to influence a more powerful partner by threatening to defect when that ally has something essential for that more powerful partner. In 432, the Spartan assembly chose war as much to protect itself from Corinthian defection as to curtail the power of Athens. A decade later, Spartan policymakers were again faced with uncomfortable realities, and again they were under pressure from their allies, but this time they made a different choice, at least in the short term. A curious feature of Thucydides' Great Peloponnesian War is that it was in fact several conflicts, and the fighting between Sparta and Athens was separated by a brief peace agreed to in 421 by the major combatants. Like the Treaty of Versailles 2,000 years later, the Peace of Nicias was meant to usher in a prolonged era of peace following a destructive Great War. Instead, its shortcomings set the stage for an even more prolonged and destructive war. The peace agreement itself, attempts to undermine it, and its subsequent breakdown provide us with important insights into the importance of allies during the conflict itself. We see both the flexibility of alliances, often driven by domestic politics, and how they can be exploited to overturn existing balances of power. So both sides had suffered terrible losses from 10 years of war. Thucydides, ever the keen observer, succinctly distilled the mood. The Spartans, he writes, found the war had gone very differently from what they had imagined when they believed that they could destroy the power of Athens in a few years simply by laying waste her land. The disaster suffered on the island, he was referring to Sphacteria, had been something which had never been known before in Sparta. Her territory was being raided from Pylos, the Helots were deserting, and there was always the fear that even those who remained loyal might gain confidence from the others and take advantage of the situation to make a revolution. It happened, too, that the 30 years truce between Sparta and Argos was on the point of expiring. They also suspected that some of the states in the Peloponnese had the intention of going over to Argos, as indeed they did. Meanwhile, Athens had suffered the loss of a third of its population to plague. Its great leader Pericles was one of the victims. There had been battlefield defeats at Delium and Amphipolis. As Thucydides records, the Athenians no longer possessed the same confidence in their strength, which had induced them to reject previous offers of peace. They were also apprehensive about their allies, fearing that they might be encouraged by these defeats to revolt. So in both passages, we see the role of alliances in the push for peace. Athens, not trusting the loyalty of her allies, felt that peace was necessary to avoid revolt in her empire. Here it's worth highlighting that Thucydides, like most accounts of ancient Athens, actually conflates the members of Athens' Delian League or empire with other client states and allies. Thucydides' phrase is almost always the Athenians and their allies. Members of the League during this time, however, were mixed. Many states were tribute-paying clients of an Athenian empire. They were not allies as we understand them. Their membership in the League was compelled by force, and tribute was extracted from them. There are a separate group of states that seem to have been more in line with our understanding of allies, in the sense that they were voluntarily cooperating under the framework of an official treaty. The defection of Athenian allies, usually in the form of revolt against the Delian League, was a real concern for Athens and occurred frequently during the war. In most cases, the revolts were fomented by oligarchs within the cities who wished to pull away from Athens. But the constant stasis within most Greek polis also imposed real limits on Athenian power and exposed the vulnerability of parts of its alliance system, where changes in the type of government could result in diplomatic realignment. During this period, Sparta was also concerned that its Peloponnesian League was on the verge of collapse. To mollify these fears, Athens and Sparta concluded their own defensive alliance, which seems to have been aimed at the two powers jointly acting against those who refused to comply with the Peace of Nicias. Thucydides records that when Sparta's allies, most prominently Corinth and Thebes, refused to acquiesce to the peace, Sparta simply dismissed their representatives and proceeded to form an alliance with Athens. To Corinth in particular, which had played such a vital role in driving Sparta to war in the first place, at least in my interpretation, this volte-face was perceived as a betrayal and was met with Corinth's own diplomatic maneuvering. Neither Sparta nor Athens fully fulfilled the terms of the treaty, each blaming the other, of course. Sparta's compliance was also complicated by her inability to compel her allies to observe the provisions of the treaty. In spite of the peace, there were still powerful voices in both Athens and Sparta willing to continue the fight. These actors knew full well that they needed the support of their allies to renew the war. A complex series of diplomatic maneuvers followed. With a brief description, we can see how threats to the alliance structure and changes in it were primary drivers of the renewal of the war. Argos, a major polis in the Peloponnese, which had remained neutral during the first phase of the war, because it had its treaty with Sparta, would prove central to this phase. Its peace treaty with Sparta expired. There was intense competition within the city of Argos between oligarchs and democrats for control. The oligarchic party, not surprisingly, favored an accommodation with Sparta through a renewal of the expiring peace. The Democrats favored confrontation with Sparta and alliance with Athens. Athens, Sparta, and Corinth all realized that the divisions within Argos represented a potential opening through which they could realize their own foreign policy objectives. Argive instability provided a key opportunity for Athenians who sought to overturn the peace before the dust had cleared from the inscriptions carrying its terms. Thucydides records that the Athenian, quote, war party, led by Alcibiades, began to make itself felt immediately. After the agreement was reached, Alcibiades' own opportunistic goal, of course, was to form an alliance with Argive Democrats to provoke Sparta by further weakening its position in the Peloponnese, thus undermining its position of dominance within its Peloponnesian League. The Spartans seem to have been aware of these overtures, and their peace party looked to engineer an alliance with the Argive oligarchs as a countermeasure. This would keep Argos on the sidelines and leave Athens no chance to provoke a rupture in the peace. Corinthian diplomats, on the other hand, worked to make this peace agreement between Athens and Sparta fail. Their goal was to push Sparta back into conflict. Failing that, they began overtures toward Argos, hoping to establish a new Argive-Corinthian axis to dominate the Peloponnese, in which Sparta would be sidelined. From the Spartan perspective, I think, an Argive-Corinthian alliance represented the most damaging possible realignment. That's Thucydides' perspective as well. It would create a direct challenge to Spartan hegemony in the Peloponnese. If successful, it would also restrict Sparta to operations within the southern Peloponnese, as Corinth could still block overland access to Attica and Boeotia at the isthmus. Thucydides' account of the diplomacy of this period is surprisingly lacking in detail. It is possible that he didn't have access to the relevant information concerning Corinthian and Argive policymaking, and so could shed little light on what happened. It's also possible that the diplomatic realignments of this period were not coherent with his overall thesis of the conflict between Athens and Sparta, and so he minimized the events of the time. We can attempt to piece together what occurred in general terms. When Sparta failed to conclude either an alliance with Argos or a renewal of its peace treaty, Corinth and Argos became allies. Sparta continued to pressure Corinth and its other allies to reject Argive leadership in the Peloponnese, and to support her position, the Spartans even leaned on their new friends in Athens. A competition of sorts between Argos and Sparta began for Athenian support. Although Sparta and Athens were recent enemies, there were still enough Athenians who believed in compromise with Sparta to make such a debate possible. Partially facilitated by the diplomacy of Alcibiades, Athens concluded an alliance with Argos, what was called a sister democracy, as Thucydides tells us. This pact was quickly extended to two other city-states, Mantinea and Elis. Elis, which controlled the northwestern Peloponnese, was a traditional Spartan ally. Like many allies in this period, however, Elis was drifting away from Sparta, in this case angered by Sparta's assistance toward the independence of one of her clients. Elis's defection was yet more evidence that Sparta's control of the Peloponnesian League was in real jeopardy of collapsing during this period. This new alignment, as it all settled out, did not suit the Corinthians, who now executed their own diplomatic volte-face. They abandoned the creation of a new partnership with Argos and returned to the Spartan fold. Corinthian hostility toward Athens and its long history of partnership with Sparta proved too strong to shake. By concluding an alliance with Athens, Argos had failed to exercise the role Corinth had hoped it would as a balancer against Athens, and instead Argos had allied with Athens against Corinth's interests, and more significantly, as a direct threat to Sparta. This new Argive-Athenian alliance represented a major realignment for the Hellenic world. In its own way, it was only slightly less threatening to Sparta than the Argive-Corinthian pact. Athens had gained for itself a major ally in the Peloponnese, and one which aimed to overthrow Spartan hegemony. As witnessed during the earlier crisis over Corcyra, which all of you know very well, a major realignment in the alliance landscape proved a spark for war. Athens' alliance with Argos was soon put to the test. In 418, after Argos refused to renew the peace with Sparta, a Spartan army, which Thucydides describes as the finest Greek army ever raised, marched against Argos. This army was composed not only of the Spartans in full strength, but picked men from Arcadia, Boeotia, Corinth, and her allies. Surprisingly, the Spartan king who commanded this force, Agis, did not engage in a battle. Instead, with the full might of the Peloponnesian League at his back, he concluded a 4-month treaty with the Argives and withdrew. Many in Sparta were furious with Agis's cowardly display. Thucydides records that they proposed a motion to destroy his home and fine him the enormous sum of 100,000 drachma. This proposal was not adopted, but the Spartans did take the unprecedented move of appointing a commission of 10 Spartiates to advise the king, without whose agreement he had no authority to withdraw from enemy land. Not surprisingly, from what we have already observed concerning the importance of allies to Spartan foreign policy, it was a new threat from another partner that spurred the Spartans to action. Shortly after establishing this new arrangement for command, word reached the Spartans from, quote, their friends in Tegea, a large Peloponnesian ally, indicating that if they, the Spartans, did not come at once, Tegea would secede from Sparta to join Argos and its allies. Given the recent actions of Corinth and Elis, this seemed to be a genuine threat. It was also, as we've already shown, one the Spartans could not ignore. They, Thucydides tells us, reacted with unprecedented speed, sending out a full levy of citizens and helots to march on Argos. Spartan haste was understandable. They were scrambling to prevent the dissolution of the Peloponnesian League itself and their hegemony in the Peloponnese. As Spartan forces approached Argos, however, the Athenians were confronted with a dilemma. Their new ally, Argos, was under attack, and their treaty obligations required them to assist, but at the same time, the attacker was Sparta, which at this period was another Athenian ally. Most importantly, many Athenians had no wish to resume war with Sparta so soon after bringing hostilities to a close. As at the naval engagement of Sybota 15 years earlier, the Athenians, though small in numbers and cautious about their treaty commitments, entered the battle. The Spartan army met the Argive and Athenian forces at Mantinea. In a hard-fought battle, the Athenian-Argive alliance was defeated by the Spartans and her Peloponnesian allies. Tegea remained loyal to Sparta. Only 1,000 of the 8,000 hoplites in the allied army had been from Athens, and they could claim that they had only fought at Mantinea against Sparta to fulfill their treaty obligations to the Argives. Sparta, of course, had attacked Argos, an Athenian ally, and the Athenians had been obliged to defend its ally. Under this interpretation, of course, they hadn't violated their peace treaty with Sparta, although they had actually fought and killed Spartan forces in the field. Few people, least of all Thucydides, was fooled by this legalistic approach, but the Spartans were not yet ready to renew the war. Incredibly, the Spartans appear to have accepted a circumscribed literal interpretation of the agreements with Athens and did not declare that the Athenians had violated the terms of the Peace of Nicias. Instead, with Tegea secured, Argos defeated, and the loyalty of the major players in the Peloponnese reestablished, Spartan forces returned home. This episode, I think, demonstrates the flexible nature of alliances, even or perhaps especially in the face of competition among major powers, and how alignment and realignment among major players can serve as a spark for war. As in the episode dealing with Corinthian grievances over Corcyra or Potidaea, we see the importance of alliances in Spartan foreign policy. We also see how diplomacy could be used, in this case by Athens, to reorient the balance of power and to gain an advantage without fighting. Mantinea had been a very close call for Sparta, as Alcibiades proudly remarked later to the Athenian assembly. In forming a coalition with Argos and Elis, he had, quote, made the Spartans risk their all on the issue of one day's fighting, and nearly pulled off an incredible victory at a small risk to Athens. Alcibiades' next venture, however, would prove far riskier for Athens and would have disastrous consequences. Our third case of alliances is the famous Athenian expedition to Sicily. Often presented as the result of Alcibiades' ambitions and the insatiable imperial expansion of Athens, alliances were nevertheless at the heart of this incident. When, as Thucydides tells us, the Athenians resolved to go again into Sicily, and if they could wholly subdue it, they did so under the pretext of aiding their allies, the Egestians. According to Thucydides, the Egestians instigated Athenian involvement in Sicilian affairs. Here the evidence from Thucydides is mixed. While he makes the outright accusation that the Egestians manipulated the Athenians, he also presents other evidence that suggests other factors were at play. We know that in 427, the Athenians had sent an expedition of 20 ships to Sicily to support Leontini, and a coalition of Ionian Greeks against Syracuse, and a coalition of Dorian city-states, which were all members of the Spartan alliance. The expedition not only supported Athenian allies against Spartan allies, but as Thucydides himself reports, served as an experiment to see if it would be possible to bring Sicily under their Athenian control. More immediately, Thucydides also identifies the essential role Sicily played in supplying food to their Peloponnesian allies. Thucydides argues that in reality, the Athenian motivation for this first expedition to Sicily was to prevent any import of grain from that area to the Peloponnese. From this account, we see that the internal politics, economic interests, securing food supplies, and the military capabilities of Sicily were all considerations for Athenian policymakers. Those favoring this second expedition were encouraged in their desires by the delegation from Egesta. The Egestians were warring with their neighbors, the Selinuntines, who were allies of Syracuse, the most powerful polis in Sicily. A fragmentary inscription of uncertain date, most probably 458, from the Acropolis attests to an alliance between Athens and Egesta. To fight the Selinuntines, the Egestians needed external support and approached other Sicilian city-states and even Carthage before settling on sending an embassy to Athens. Athenian intervention, they argued, was not simply to aid Egesta in a limited local conflict. Their threat, echoing the appeal of the Corsyrans from 15 years earlier, was that if Egesta would be subjugated by Selinunte, and that through that Syracuse would indirectly become stronger. If Athens failed to come to the aid of Egesta, it would pave the way for Syracuse to conquer the entire island of Sicily. In time, because Syracuse was originally a Peloponnesian colony, they could be a threat to Athens itself. During the famous debate over whether to sail to Sicily, Nicias, still a major figure in Athenian politics, spoke in opposition to the expedition. He denounced the campaign as dangerous adventurism and claimed to see no value in coming to the aid of Egesta. We ought not to let ourselves be persuaded by foreigners into undertaking war with which we have nothing to do. He didn't add the quarrel of a distant people in a foreign land of which we don't know anything, but he could have. In other words, Egesta might be an Athenian ally, but their war did not reflect the interests of Athens. Alcibiades, the foremost advocate of the expedition, framed Athenian action in terms of aiding its allies. What excuse can we offer to our allies in Sicily for not helping them? he asked the Athenian assembly. They are our confederates. We are bound to assist them. Further, Alcibiades added that the expedition, if successful, would increase the size of Athens' empire and allied contingents, allowing them to overwhelm the Peloponnesians in the future. Here, Thucydides, I think, shows us the challenging sides of alliances, not necessarily the stark divide of independence of foreign policy versus entrapment, but the complexity of negotiating mutual interest. In the arguments of both Nicias and Alcibiades, Thucydides presents a purely realist perspective that the expansion of power of a rival is, by the very nature of that expanding power, a threat. Increasing one's power comes with the opportunity to increase it further, and the increase in the power of an adversary is a fundamental threat. Here, toward the end of his work, he echoes the Athenian explanation for the extension of the Delian League, which appeared in Book 1. In that earlier example, the Athenians justified power expansion on the grounds of fear, honor, and self-interest, with fear as their principal motive. Even with the prominence of fear, we are also forced to consider interest more broadly. It was surely in the interest of Egesta that the Athenians come and prevent their subjugation by the Selanudians and their allies in Syracuse. But what was Athens' interest? Was it further involvement in Sicily, or consolidation closer to home? Was it, this is open to debate, both for the assembly of the Athenians and for observers ever since. Was it really in the interest of Syracuse to pursue a campaign of conquest in Greece, as the Egestians feared that they would, and were trying to convince the Athenians that they should be afraid of? If the subsequent history is any guide, Athenian fears that Syracuse planned to turn its considerable power toward the Greek mainland and Athenian possessions in the east was misplaced. Syracuse spent the 100 years after the defeat of the Athenian expedition locked in a series of wars with its Sicilian and Italian neighbors and contesting dominance of Sicily with Carthage. It never turned east. The Egestians bolstered their pleas with specific reminders of another Sicilian polis, Leontini. Athens had intervened almost 10 years previously to help Leontini in the face of Syracusan aggression. But in the intervening years, Leontini had been defeated and destroyed by the Syracusans. As with Egesta, Athens had a formal treaty of alliance with Leontini dating back to 433. At Leontini, as in other cases, the Athenians had intervened on the side of the Democratic Party, which had been attacked by the Syracusans in order to prevent them from carrying out a policy of land redistribution. Now the Egestians argued, if Syracuse, after driving out the people of Leontini, were allowed to escape scot-free and to go on to destroy the remaining allies of Athens until she acquired complete control of Sicily, the danger would then have to be faced that at some time or other, the Syracusans would come with a large force to the aid of their Dorian kinsmen. Syracuse's Dorian kinsmen, of course, was a veiled reference to the Dorian Spartans, who were considering relaunching military operations against the Athenians in the wake of the collapse of the Peace of Nicias. Thucydides records remarkable similarities between the Egestan embassy that reignited the war and the famous Corcyraean embassy that helped launch it in the first place. In the case of Sicily, as in the case of Corcyra, the Athenians were approached by allies. With a history of intervention in Sicily, the Athenians were persuaded to send another expedition, this time a larger one, with the intent of establishing Athenian control over much, if not all, of the island. Again, intervention was framed as necessary for maintaining Athenian dominance, particularly at sea, although it had the double advantage of interrupting food supplies to the Peloponnese and perhaps augmenting the supply of grain to the ever-hungry city of Athens itself. As with the case of Corcyra, the primary concern was the long-term viability of Athens' empire. As in the case of Corcyra, the initial foe was not Sparta. In the Corcyran case, the foe was Sparta's ally, Corinth. In the case of Sicily, it was Syracuse. Not surprisingly, as in the Corcyra crisis, the prospect of Athenian intervention brought with it appeals by Syracuse to both Corinth and Sparta for assistance against Athens. As in the earlier case, there was a debate in Sparta over whether Athenian actions constituted a violation of an existing peace treaty between Sparta and Athens, and therefore a justification for war. Once more, it was Sparta's allies, predominantly Corinth, who took the lead in opposing Athens, and then in working to convince Sparta to enter the conflict. Various polis in Sicily had to navigate the difficulties of choosing whether to support the Syracusans, the Athenians, or to chart the precarious waters of neutrality. Finally, as in the case of Corcyra, the war between Athens and Sparta renewed when the Spartans judged that the Athenians had definitively broken the terms of the treaty. This time, the war would continue until the total defeat of Athens. So the three episodes I've focused on provide some detail on how Thucydides viewed alliance dynamics. As I proposed at the beginning, Thucydides illustrates a complex view of alliances in which we must consider deeper meanings of power, fear, and interest. Power, for example, is not only a question of men and ships, but of moral obligation, the dependability of allies, and the loyalty of client states. Fear is not only the fear of a growing rival, but the fear of defection among one's own allies and the fear of losing credibility. Interest is not only a question of expanding power, but of securing the relationships on which power depends, and in determining which relationships are likely to be most durable and thus the greatest source of strength. From these lessons, we see Thucydides has indeed produced a work of enduring value for all time, not just for history or for military operations, but for statecraft itself. I thank you all very much for your attention, especially on a beautiful Athenian evening like this, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you very much.
Very much. We had a very strong presentation. Now we have equally strong commentators that we are looking forward to your comments. Star ladies, yes, this is what I was thinking.
Thank you very much for this excellent talk, Andrew. I feel like a stranger here. I think you're mostly at home here, but let me start with 3 points. The first point that came out of your presentation was the flexibility of interpretations through time. Thucydides really left us an enduring work, κτήμα εσαΐ. And facts may change from time to time, but interpretations on the unchangeable nature of man, on the unchangeable human nature, are actually adjusted to the zeitgeist of each and every generation, of each and every time. I like the spagat you made between ancient Atheniaiki Demokratia, Athenian democracy, and the modern world. Since, for instance, in the Cold War, we used to talk about the bipolar system. But if we read Thucydides the way you read Thucydides, then we can understand why the non-aligned movement, for instance, existed, or that junior partners could actually impose their interests on the alliances we thought that belonged to one pole or the other. Just like you didn't mention France and Greece that left the military branch of NATO. I mean, they didn't leave NATO, but they did left the military branch of NATO. For 40 years, France, and for 6 years, Greece, that was traumatizing the alliance, the unity of the alliance at that time. And that was really a big thing to do during the Cold War and the height of the Cold War. So other forces really influence the decision-making process, and the decision-making process interests us perhaps even more after 1945 regarding the outbreak of war, because we don't see a lot of ceasefires after that, since we have to do with nuclear powers and especially the beginning of war, which is in Thucydides very obvious in book 1 from 71 to 88, I think. I'm not an expert on Thucydides right now, but I've read a lot of Thucydides for entering the Department of History and Archaeology, so it's a unique opportunity to study him again and see his books here. The second thing, and the way that you stress the role of Corinth actually stresses this idea is that junior partners have really an ample space of maneuvering towards strong partners like Sparta. And we've seen that also in the modern world. We've seen that junior partners have very often tried to move perhaps not so flexible great powers in order to impose their interests, their fears, their endeavors for having more prestige and more honor on their side. For instance, it's very interesting to notice that Corinth was tolerating actually Athens in 460 regarding Megara, but it wasn't tolerant anymore when Athens was threatening the naval power of Corinth in Kerkyra and in Corfu and in Potidea. This is a different time, and perhaps for Corinth it's the last time, the unique last time that she has in order to defend her position among the naval powers of Greece. And the third point I would like to do for the beginning is that hegemonic war is not inevitable. And here perhaps I raise an issue that creates a lot of differences between IR experts and historians regarding, for instance, World War I. For World War I, we historians believe that it was inevitable. And IR experts, especially with experience they have gained after 1945, since war became unthinkable, is that it could have been avoided if perhaps conflict resolution had been implemented, and perhaps the Serbs and the Austrians would not have all pushed us into World War I. So we need not only to think in IR terms, perhaps, but also to take a lot of help from psychology, sociology, history, in order to understand how different people might behave in different situations. And perhaps Thucydides gives us a key in order to unlock the soul of different nations when it comes to hostilities. Because the way they proceed with decision-making is different from one time to the other. So we have to delve much more into human nature, into the history of human nature. So these are the first points I would like to make, and let's go ahead. Thank you.
Well, Andrew, thank you for a fascinating talk. This is really your next book. Alliance Theory in Thucydides. That's the title of the book. That's precisely what you presented right now. So, which is natural. I mean, it's really an extension of your previous work. Okay, let me tell you what I like and what I don't like with your presentation. What I like is the holistic approach versus cherry picking. I mean, starting from the famous Allison book on Thucydides' trap, he takes a couple of sentences and he presents a whole argument. You, both in your book and in your presentation, you have read the whole Thucydides, and you can make a holistic argument, understanding all the complexities, and most importantly, the different level of analysis that he operates. Thucydides does not operate only at the structural level, which is the typical explanation, like the power transition post-war. So you highlighted personalities, you highlighted domestic structures, and of course, you highlighted alliance dynamics plus power as a transition. So you make a very complex argument which represents Thucydides' work. So that's, I want to compliment you for that, because most of the ones, the scholars on Thucydides, they cherry pick. Not only Allison, the majority. I also like the way that you highlighted the triptych of fear, interest, and reputation, doxa. Phobos, inferon, doxa. And the way that you have used it in order to highlight different parts of the analysis. The other thing that I like that you reject structural explanation and you pick up the choice, because there were choices along the way. You highlighted Sthenelaidas, but at the same time, he was discussing with Archidamos. It could have gone different way. You highlighted the Athenian decision in the Corfu, Kerkyra, Kosira, that it was a debate that could have gone a different way. I mean, the one day the Athenians decided not to help Kosira. The second day decided to help it. So you see, the whole thing means that it's not predetermined. The future is uncertain and choices matter. I also like that the way that you have dealt the trade-offs between abandonment and entrapment, which is central on the issue of the analysis. And I will come back to entrapment. And your analysis highlighted the Kautilya's dictum of the enemy is a friend, that it's always central. So all the things I like. Now let me turn to the things that I don't like. Let's come to the causes of war. Scholars like you, for some reason that I don't understand, they want to blame one country for the causes of war. So Badian say, oh, it's the Athenians. Saint Croix said, you know, it's the Spartans. And Novo said it's the Corinthians. You know, Thucydides did not get involved into this blame game. His argument was complex, that yes, power transition make Athens greater, stronger. And this created fear. But why fear was created? Because Sparta was vulnerable to its allies. But why Sparta was vulnerable to its allies? Because its silly domestic structure that was a stratocratic militaristic society, that it was a police state, and they needed the Peloponnesian allies in order to maintain the primacy over the Helots, and all these war distractions, or it would have upended the domestic system. So really, it's the domestic structure of Sparta that creates the window of opportunity for Corinth to play these silly games. And then, of course, comes Corinth as a catalyst. So what I try to suggest, it's not as clear that you presented it. Thucydides makes a very complex argument on the causes of war. Now, let me come to a very critical question, entrapment. I think Sparta was entrapped. And it was entrapped because of its vulnerability. And also, the Athenians, not exactly entrapped, but they wanted to entrap because they had other reasons. Let me play the similarities that you have played between Egesta and Kosira, Corfu. The similarities on both cases was that the Athenians wanted to expand. I mean, Thucydides said that the Corfu incident was not just the discussion about the fleet, but they wanted a stepping stone to Sicily. So clearly, also in the case of Kosira, imperialism and expansion was there. And also, Thucydides says clearly, they didn't care about Egesta. They needed an excuse in order to intervene. And they were ready to intervene, by the way, 427, with the 20 ships, because they saw an opportunity. And when the admirals there, they did not see the opportunity, and they did not occupy Sicily and came back, they almost killed them. And that's why Nicias was so much afraid that if he comes with empty hand back to Athens, they will take care of him. And that's why he decided to kill the Athenians and kill himself instead of coming back and have the same fate of the admirals at 27. They did not actually kill them, but they discharged them, and it was very honorable for them. So the Athenians going to Sicily was not for fear of Sicily, that they will change the balance of power with the Spartans. It was pure imperialism. And Alcibiades said clearly, if we don't expand, we'll die. And actually, Sicily was not the target. It was a stepping stone toward Carthage. The Athenians and the Phoenicians, that were the metropolis of the Carthage, they always had trouble and were fighting for the control of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Athenians managed to prevail mostly by beating the Phoenicians in the Battle of Salamis, and they controlled Eastern Mediterranean, but they wanted Mare Nostrum. They wanted essentially to do what the Romans did to Carthage and control the whole Mediterranean. So the driving force was imperialism, at least in the second phase of the war. Now, another issue that I disagree with you is whether Corinth had a choice when they threatened the Spartans. You see, if the international system is bipolar, you don't really have a choice. You stick with the Spartans because you cannot go with the Athenians. If it's multipolar, the way that it emerged later, when Sicily and the Persians played role. So what I'm trying to suggest is that the first 10 years of the war, the system was bipolar. And in that bipolarity, you don't really have choice. In the second phase, more actors was involved, it was multipolar. So what you mentioned about Argos and Corinth and all these things, it's a change of system. So I think if the Spartans has called the bluff of the Corinthians, where could they go? Argos, it had a treaty with Sparta, could not ally with them. So Argos became available only after the treaty expired. So it was a bluff that the Spartans were entrapped, and they fell into it. And actually, the clever guy was not Sthenelaidas, was the king. The Archidamos, the other guy that was the wise, and said, you know, don't let these guys entrap you. You know, we have to look at our interest, and our interest said that we are not ready to make this war. And he was absolutely right. In fact, the Spartans lost the first 10-year war. Exactly as Archidamos had predicted, is precisely how Pericles had designed. So this type of smaller objections I have to your work, with the biggest objection is Corinth as a core of war. You start making the complex argument, you should take it all the way and not, you know, just blame Corinth for the causes of war. Now, what you have suggested, mostly about entrapment, is very central in current international politics. Take your country, the United States. It's close to be entrapped in Ukraine. It has to find a balance, how much to help an ally, but not to get into a nuclear war, which is very difficult balance. You know, do you send troops? What kind of weapons you send? How you allow the Ukrainians to use the weapons? Should they target critical infrastructure, including refineries or strategic command and control in Russia? I mean, the limits there are not clear. But the most important problem that you have for entrapment is Japan. Japan is in a fundamental conflict with China. And Japan is completely dependent upon you, unless it gets nuclear weapons, which is always a possibility. So the way that you are probably entrapped in conflict with China because of your allies, it's a central issue, I think, in American current strategy today. How to hold the balance between avoiding abandoning your allies, including Ukraine and Japan, and not get entrapped. And I think Trump has come very clear into that. The allies are entrapping us. we are not going to play the games. Abandon Ukraine and abandon Japan. That's at least in your domestic system, you have a clear argument, that these two countries are entrapping you, oh, let's abandon them.
I would like to make 3 points regarding your fascinating presentation. The one is more general. I think one of the most important contributions of Thucydides to our understanding of international relations is the role of fear. And I say this especially because under the influence of Marxism and other economistic approaches, I think we focus too much on interest, especially economic interests. Why did the United States invade Iraq? For oil? Right? Why does the United States do anything for a pipeline? These are the explanations that I find very superficial. More often it's fear, right? Fear that drives international politics. And Thucydides helps us focus on that very clearly.
Plus interest, plus.
I know that, but
Yeah.
I understand that. But too often when people analyze American foreign policy, they don't think of fear. They think first of interests. Whereas Thucydides ordered it the other way around, right? That fear is the primary motive, survival, security. Then comes prosperity, wealth. And first you have to be secure and safe. Then you can worry about being richer. Right. So I think this is a very important point. And you emphasize it often, like for senior allies, the fear that junior allies will defect. For junior allies, fear of abandonment, right? The second point I want to make is you made clear that a superpower, let's say like the Sparta or Athens, right? They need their allies. I mean, part of their power and influence is that they don't stand alone. Whether it's the Delian League that became an empire, right? From the moment the treasury moved from Delos to Athens, clearly it was no longer a real alliance. But more importantly, if leaving aside the Athenian Empire, if you have real allies, not people you completely dominate, it's important not to lose them. And I think this is now a very topical matter. I mean, if you look at the Allison argument or arguments that others made, they compare the GDP of the United States with China. Right? But the United States does not stand alone. So if you compare the GDP of the United States plus other NATO members, plus Japan, plus Australia, New Zealand, and if this nexus of alliances remains firm, then the collective West under American leadership is in a very strong position. Right? And this is something I think that Trump doesn't get, which is why he frustrated his first Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, and his first Defense Secretary, James Mattis. Right? They were very frustrated that he didn't really understand the alliance. The third point I want to make is regarding Sicily. I agree that the local ally was just a minor thing. Depriving the Spartan alliance of Sicilian food is, I think, a more important motive. But here I do think also that eventually what Alcibiades had in mind, or Alcibiades, was dominating the Mediterranean. I mean, we tend to be too easy in saying the moment they made a decision, Athens made a decision to go to Sicily, they were ruined. But that's because we know that this expedition failed. But if it had succeeded, Athens dominated already the Eastern Mediterranean, all the way to Cyprus, right? then it would dominate the central Mediterranean, and there was no power in the real Western Mediterranean. So then Athens would be very powerful as Esthanasis to dominate Carthage, right? So we should bear in mind that the stakes were really high before we dismiss too easily the decision to go to Sicily. And of course, the wrong commander remained. Nicias was against, Alcibiades was removed. I mean, things could have gone differently under other circumstances. Right, these are my points, and I welcome. I look forward to your responses to all our comments.
Well, thank you all. I mean, I guess I'm very grateful for all the comments. The intensity, even the disagreement, is welcome, because it means we're all thinking about it, which is good. I'll try to structure some responses, starting with your second point about superpowers need allies. Of course, they do, and I think if we look back in history, superpowers tend to lose when they fight alone. America was alone in Vietnam, and it lost. The British Empire was alone in the United States, and it lost. And it was actually the only time, maybe, if there's a historian of the 18th century out there to find a different example, it'd be good to know it. But I think it was the only time in the 18th century when Britain did not have a continental ally to back it up. And so because there was no Prussia threatening France and there was no Spain threatening France, because Spain and France and the Netherlands were all on the side of the United States, the British had 3/4 of their fleet at home or in the Sugar Islands protecting their interests, which is why when the French fleet caught the British fleet outside a little place called Yorktown, the French actually outnumbered the British. And that's always a curious thing I point out to my students when we go to Yorktown. We say, oh, and there were 28 French ships here and 23 British ships. And I say, wait a minute, think about that for a second. 23 British ships. This is supposed to be the Great British Navy. Where is the rest of the British fleet? So yes, superpowers definitely need allies. And this connects to the ideas of fear and interest, which I think are really important. So you're right, Thucydides does say fear was the principal motive in us establishing our empire. He does put them together in the triptych of fear, honor, and interest. And one of the things that I wanted to do in the presentation, and that Jay and I try to do in the book, is to dig a little bit deeper to understand how fear and interest and fear and power relate to each other. Because I wouldn't necessarily say that we can go with, well, it was Spartan fear that caused the war. Okay, I want to understand, why was Sparta afraid and what was it afraid of? And this goes a little bit to your point. Well, I would argue that they were afraid of the defection of Corinth. Well, why were they afraid of the defection of Corinth? If it's a bipolar world and Corinth is a minor power, well, we can ignore them. We shouldn't be afraid of them defecting as you're proposing. In the book, I argue that, well, actually, I don't see Corinth as a minor power, and I see real Spartan fear, legitimate, let's say, Spartan fear, that if they defect, we're going to have problems. We're going to have problems, not just because we'll lose them, but we'll have problems because of what losing them means to our ability to hold on to the rest of our alliance system. And I think that that's an issue for entrapment in general as a principle, right? You think, okay, can the United States, and here I should add a small disclaimer, these are not the views of the National Defense University, the Department of Defense, or the United States government. Usually when I give a Thucydides talk, I don't have to say that, but now I will say that, right? This is one of the big issues the United States faces today, because you could easily say, pick a small ally or a small NATO country and say, well, if the United States loses X as an ally, it's not a big deal. Well, it is a big deal because it means if you lose one, you can lose others. If you challenge the integrity of NATO, you're challenging the integrity of NATO, all of the NATO nations. On the question of blame, one quick point, and then I'll move to something else. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily frame it that I'm blaming Corinth. I would have the Bismarck view that, they're not any more to blame for asking for Spartan protection than the Spartans were in extending it, and they're not any more to blame than the Athenians were in defending their interests and trying to expand their empire. What the Corinth case shows to me is the fear Sparta has of losing its big important allies, because most Spartan policymakers believe that they can't govern the Peloponnesian League, that they can't remain on top without those allies. If Corinth and its money goes, if Corinth and its naval power goes, then the whole project of the Peloponnesian League is called into question. And that's why it's so important for them. So this relates to your third point about hegemonic war, its inevitability. I don't have to tell a Greek audience that inevitability is a mistranslation actually of that passage, right? The passage says Spartans, anangase, I think is the classical Greek word, that they were, anangase, right? They were compelled to fight, which is slightly different. But the idea of hegemonic war, the inevitability of war, what compels nations to fight, interests me. And the parallel that obviously we make with the First World War or even the Second would be the follow-on question of, well, what war are we trying to explain? Because the Peloponnesian War, like the First World War and like the Second World War, is actually a bundle of other conflicts. And as historians or political scientists, we have to explain all the wars as well as what we think of as the war, right? So there is a Peloponnesian War, but the Peloponnesian War is Corinth against Kerkyra, Corinth against Kerkyra and Athens, Athens against Corinth, Athens against Corinth and Sparta, eventually Athens against Sicily, then Athens against Sparta again, and then Athens against Sparta and Persia. So we have to explain all those nodes, all those dyads, to use an international relations term, so forgive me as a historian if I use an international relations term, to explain all those dyads, all those relationships. We could say the same thing with the First World War. Which war do we have to explain? Well, you have to explain the Austrian-Serbian War. You have to explain the German-Russian War. You have to explain the British-German War. And then you have to explain this other big kind of amorphous concept of the First World War. It's the same with the Second World War. Historians about the Second World War, what does the Second World War mean to you? Just ask anybody the question, when did the Second World War begin? For the United States, December 7th, 1941. You ask a Russian, they're like, wow, like 3 million people were dead by then, right? The war started on June 22nd, 1941. Well, if you were a Pole, it started on September 1st, 1939. If you were an Italian, it started in 1940. If you were in Manchuria, it started in 1937. So part of the challenge of what IR theorists talk in these big hegemonical wars of hegemony is that it's often a bundle of conflicts that we're trying to explain. And a point I would add on that theme is one of the interesting things that comes about when we try to explain why are the states going to war, why are they fighting, what are the sources of their fear, is it's important to remember that there is a start and stop nature to these conflicts. And that's also a curious thing when you think about how wars function, right? I mean, why is there a peace in the middle of the Peloponnesian War? How does that impact questions of inevitability? How does it impact questions of fear, of being compelled to fight? If at some point you can say, you know what, we fought, it was not a lot of fun for either of us, let's stop. And enough people support that. And that goes back to another question that was raised, which is this role of domestic politics. Because I think one of the great lessons we see in Thucydides is his observation on the importance of domestic politics and the way a lot of issues are decided in what we might term a sort of 51-49 manner. It's not that Sparta necessarily wants war with Athens. There is a group of Spartans that want war with Athens. Sometimes they win the public debate and there's war. Sometimes they lose the public debate and there's peace. And it's the same with Athens or Corinth or any other state. And it is the same today with the United States and China, or with Russia and Ukraine. I mean, Russia, well, it's a different system, but but the idea of this plays to the idea of inevitability, because it is choice, and it is the choice of policymakers and citizens depending on the political system. So that at least covers some of the discussion.
Let me try to provoke the discussion a bit. I don't want to sound like Trump, but if you are the United States,
Interesting.
if you're the United States and you're not really a country, you're a continent, you control 25% of the world wealth. You are the top, you control the heights of technology. You have energy. You have natural resources. What in this Goliath the Greeks, the Spaniards, the Italians have to offer? And to respond to my friend Harris, if you consider the West as a total with the United States leading, you assume that the Spaniards, the Italians, and the Greeks, they will fight the Chinese. Is that so? I mean, with difficulty, the Americans will manage to mobilize the Japanese and the Australians in case of war with China. So these kind of big groupings, they don't make a lot of sense to me. And as Trump correctly said, you know, if Montenegro made the stupid thing with Russia and I have to defend Montenegro, I get to the war with Russia. That's what he said in his previous term in office. And more or less, he's saying the same thing now with Ukraine. So I can understand why the Athenians and the Spartans needed allies. But I'm not sure the Americans today that have such a huge difference compared to the others, they need allies. And if they need allies, if these allies will be useful for them in their main problem, which is China. How many of their allies will fight along with the United States, China? Nobody. Or maybe the Japanese, or maybe the Australians, but that's it. Okay, I throw the bomb here, so you.
True that the consolidation that existed during the Cold War does not exist anymore between allies.
But the Ukrainian war has actually galvanized the alliance that was declared brain dead in 2019 by Macron. So if there is a result of the Ukrainian war regarding NATO, this is a result. And the United States, in my opinion, cannot be everywhere, do not have everywhere vital interests or interests. So the Europeans have to take part of their burden sharing on their shoulders. And perhaps the Ukrainian war is also a paradigm for the next generation threat, which is China.
Essentially, you say that Trump said that the Europeans, they have to take care of the defense of themselves instead of waiting for the Americans to do
At the
it.
same
That's
time,
you
I
are
said
making
that
my
they need
argument.
allies. At the same time, I said that they need allies. So it's like Joe Biden argument.
So Andrew, what's your take on this?
Well, I mean, I think it's a two-part answer. One is, there is, as I said, from Thucydides' history at the end, the idea that power is not just men and ships. Power is also these moral questions, power of ideas, power of ideologies. And so a United States or any power that turns to the world and says, you know, you're small, you don't matter. This is not a very good ideological position on which to base yourself. This is the same idea of, you know, why do we generally not like totalitarian governments? What makes us uneasy about it? What makes us uneasy about it is the road from totalitarianism to the destruction of anybody the totalitarian doesn't like. I mean, we can go right up there to the Acropolis. There was a very famous debate on the Acropolis, or not, the Areopagos, right, next to it. It was an Athenian debate. And the guy who was in charge of the courts that day was a very famous Athenian named Socrates. And the Athenian demos wanted the 10 admirals who could command it at Arginusa, the famous Arginusa trial. The Athenian populace said, these 10 guys, they were all in command. We try them together, we convict them together, we execute them together. Socrates said, excuse me. Constitution of Athens. Every Athenian citizen is entitled to a separate trial. You can't try them collectively, can't convict them collectively, you certainly can't execute them collectively. So the Athenians said, okay, we wait for Socrates to leave. The demos is always sovereign. We kill them. And they did. And then they killed Socrates. And that's exactly why the Spartans and later the Romans looked at Athenian democracy and said, this is crazy. This kind of democracy where the 51 can do whatever it wants to the 49 with no check and no balance on its power is not democracy, it's not freedom. It's actually just another kind of tyranny. It's the tyranny of the majority. And that's why every system, including Greece's, including the United States's, ours is a very old one now, creaking a little bit, has checks and balances put in because it doesn't want to have the tyranny of the majority. So we have to ask ourselves, what sort of world do we want to live in? And we don't want to live in a world. It's not healthy for us. It's not safe in the long run for any of us to live in a world where the powerful says to the less powerful, oh, today, yeah, okay, fine. We're the United States. We're 340 million people. You're Greece. We're 12 million people. We don't care what you have to say. Because at the end of the day, no one wants to live in that world. And I don't think Thucydides did either, because we all know how book 5 ends with the destruction of Melos, right? The Athenians kill all the men, sell all the women in slavery, and then go and inhabit the colony themselves, send out colonists. The next line of the book, in the next year, the next season, the Athenians decided to sail to Sicily. This is a very strong juxtaposition of the dangerous road we go when we believe in the power of power, the pure power of power. Because at the end of the day, I think Hobbes is right. We have to have some sort of equality because the weakest can kill the strongest. The weakest can kill the strongest by deception or in coordination with others. And so if the United States or Trump or any other leader says, oh, I don't need this country today because it's small, they should be very careful about that because we don't know what tomorrow holds. The second point is not everything is war. And so why does the United States, okay, yes, maybe yes, in a war, the United States, do we need the Spaniards in war? I mean, even Europe, I mean, when the Italian foreign minister came out and said, I want a national army, the Spaniards said, no, that's a bad idea. We're not going to be part of this. So maybe we don't need the Spaniards in war. But international politics is more than war. There are other aspects to power. I think Thucydides actually shows us a lot about other aspects of power beyond how power works in war. And so aspects of power that come from ideology, aspects of power that come from domestic stability, aspects of power that come from economics, aspects of power that come from deterrence are extremely important. And so from a deterrent perspective, if any ally is willing to sell out its weaker allies or its less important allies according to the needs of today, that makes its deterrent value much less, it makes its deterrent power much less convincing in the future. And the last point I would say is, one of the things, and we try to teach this, it's a very complicated thing to teach, or at least I find it complicated to teach, is that when power is exercised, there is like a transaction cost to power, right? There's a transaction cost to exercising power. Like if you have a kid and you want the kid to take a bath, you can, at the end of the day, I don't recommend this, but at the end of the day, you can physically take the child to the bath and wash them. It's kind of like washing a cat. Water goes everywhere, right? But you are exercising power, but you are really like forced to use all your transactional costs to do it. Any power in charge of an alliance wants there to be absolutely the lowest possible transaction cost to their power with regard to their allies. So what do Greeks, Italians, or Spaniards have to offer Goliath, the United States? Well, the better our relationship is, the lower the cost to transaction of power. If the United States says, we want some sanctions on Russia, they say, okay, sure. The United States says, we want economic sanctions. We want you to expel diplomats. We want you to open this. Can you do that? They say, sure, you're a friend. We do it. If you start treating these countries like they're not allies or friends, like they're just unnecessary appendages, you're going to increase the transaction cost of power. And if you increase the transaction cost of power, you deplete whatever reserve of power you have until you're left powerless.
Thank you very much, Professor, for your presentation. My name is Gouvaras Konstantinos, and I'm a PhD candidate in London University, International Relationship. So, since we are in Greece, I feel that I'm compelled to ask you, do you believe that Turkey is a modern-day Corinth? I mean, in relation to how reliable is as a NATO member? Also, thank you very much again.
So I always defer to my colleagues from the State Department when we talk about Turkey. You know, there's an old expression people will tell you, if you've ever done business in Japan, pardon me, a small tangent, right? If you've ever done business in Japan, you can tell the degree of difficulty you're asking by how prolonged and how loud the intake of air is to your Japanese interlocutor. Right? So if you say that, if you offer them something really bad, they'll go like, right? If you offer them something that's not so bad, they go. So you gauge the sort of allies with the State Department people by how upset they look when you raise the topic and the kind of words they use. And so usually when you raise the question of Turkey with someone from the State Department, they go like, oh, there's a lot of face rubbing and some complicated relationship. And so, you know, the interesting thing with Corinth is, you know, if we let's try to map out this parallel. So if Turkey is Corinth and the United States is Sparta, who would Athens be, right? Who is the country that is threatening Turkey more than it's threatening the United States? That therefore Turkey can draw the United States into some sort of conflict. That dynamic, I don't really see. Right? I don't see any country out there that is threatening Turkey so much more than it is threatening the United States, and so where Turkey would want a more hawkish policy. Like I don't see, for example, Iran. Turkey saying, you know what, America, you need to get in there and do something about Iran because, you know, we're worried about it more than you are. In terms of challenging allies, as Sparta had with Corinth, yes, there are many issues where the United States and Turkey are on different sides, and I think that is at the heart of the challenging relationship. Now, Turkish interlocutors would tell you, well, this is mostly the fault of the United States. The Turkish interlocutor would say, well, you know, you support a terrorist organization in Iraq or Syria, the Kurds. These are terrorists and you support them, and every once in a while they blow up something in Istanbul. Why do you support them? That makes it very hard for us to work together. The Turks would say, you know, we didn't want to buy the S-400, but you wouldn't update our Patriot system, so we had to buy the S-400. I think this goes back a little bit to Professor Platias's point about, you know, what do the smaller powers have to offer to the United States and how alliances are managed. We see today with Turkey that the relationship is much more transactional and much less a question of two countries with the same goals and the same approach to international politics, traveling the same road together. Now it's more a question of, okay, where are those rare instances where we overlap? And that goes back to your question about Corinth. I think Corinth and Sparta had the problem that their interests didn't always overlap, and that, as Professor Platias identified, and as I tried to make the point in the presentation, you know, only some Spartans agreed that our interests overlap with Corinth, right? If you come in and say, hey, we're Corinth, we're threatened, do something. Archidemos says, okay, yeah, I get it. cool it. You're threatened by Athens. We don't want to go to war with Athens because it's going to be a big mess for all of us. And I'm not really sure we can win.
And we don't have a theory of victory.
And
That's what
we
he
need to
said.
have a theory of victory. Exactly. You know, something better than we leave this to our children to sort out.
Yes.
And other people like Stefan Leiva say, no, okay, the ally is asking for help. Let's help them. Let's go. And so this is the complex relationship of allies, which I think exists. But you had a follow-up about the threat. Yeah, the threat point. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Athens, but there are other major powers, and perhaps they're the power of themselves.
Sure. Well, Turkey, like all nations, has always done a good job playing things for itself. I think, you know, the bipolar, as a historian, bipolar, multipolar to me is not so significant, is not so interesting almost. I mean, I agree with the point that Joseph Nye made many years ago, which was that it's wrong to think in terms of polarity because the world, this is when his famous, you know, three chessboard argument, he said, look, economically, the world is multipolar and it's been multipolar for a long time. Militarily, the world is unipolar and likely to remain that way. Although you could also add to that, that in some elements, polarity doesn't matter because you mentioned Japan could be destroyed by China unless Japan gets nuclear weapons. So every nuclear power, in a sense, is also a pole because you can't just do whatever you want to a nuclear power. So then we have, I don't know, 10, 11, 12. Are we counting Israel? Yeah, sorry. I don't want to.
Nine so far with plenty to follow.
Right? So you can't, polarity is not so easy to determine. And then, of course, Nye also makes the argument, look, there are all sorts of other elements of the international system today which make the concept of polarity kind of irrelevant, like climate change or terrorism. Does polarity matter for climate change? Absolutely not. So that's an element, I think.
Well, he persuaded them.
Very much so. Yes, of course.
I would like to go back to your first comment when you asked about how can we teach Thucydides to young students.
Yeah.
Where do alliances end in your view? Do we have to understand each other to have to share the same principles or to share the same, let's say, anthropological viewpoints? For instance, could anyhow the West ally with Russia or China, since we do not really know the civilization, because Athens and Sparta could really talk with each other. Even the Soviet Union and America could talk with each other in terms of interest.
So the definition of allies is actually, I'll start with the definition of allies. It's on the one hand, it's very easy. On the other hand, it's very difficult. It's easy because an ally is someone you have an alliance with. And an alliance is very easy to determine because it's like a really official document. It's written, it's inscribed somewhere on the Acropolis. You see it every day, every time you go to get your, you know, oat cakes as an Athenian, right? But as Professor Platias even just stated, Ukraine is an ally of the United States. Well, it's not. And one reason why there aren't American soldiers in Ukraine or anywhere near Ukraine, although maybe there are, no, is because it's a partner. And interestingly, American strategic thinking, and this is actually something I'm researching now and trying to work on now, American strategic thinking is sometimes kind of confused about this because we like to conflate these things. Just like Thucydides used to say, the Athenians and their allies, America's always saying alliance, allies and partners, partners and allies and partners, as if the two are the same, but they're not. And you only have to ask a Ukrainian and a Lithuanian why they're not the same. So where do alliances end or how do alliances form? I do think for a successful alliance, you have to have, as Professor Platias explained, you know, you have to have at least some kind of coherent theory of victory, right? Or not even victory, because you don't necessarily just make allies in wartime. Sometimes you make allies in order to avoid war. As NATO successfully avoided war with the Soviet Union. So allies have to have common foreign policy goals. It helps if they have some degree of mutual understanding and respect so that they have ways to effectively communicate with each other. Because at the end of the day, allies are partners. And partners who don't have an effective way to communicate and don't have shared goals run into all sorts of trouble. The Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were allies for almost 2 years, during which time they partitioned Poland and were entirely agreed that all of the leading Poles should die. That's not a very pleasant topic on which to form an alliance, but that was the basis for their alliance. Their alliance was, you know what? We think these people, we know these people are a state. We don't think these people should be a state. So let's go in and destroy the state. And on top of that, let's physically destroy all of the people who could make it a viable state. That's a very scary idea, right? That's why the Soviets shot 40,000 Polish prisoners, officers, right? That's why the Nazis put all the Polish officers, professors, doctors, lawyers in places like Auschwitz, because they wanted to eliminate the concept of a Polish state now and forever. So allies should form because they have coherent objectives that they share. They endure when they have shared values and shared ways of communicating. And hopefully they do that for the betterment of mankind and not for the more destructive aims which we have seen in the past.
So, thank you very much for your presence here. I wish we had more time because this is a fascinating discussion. We don't have it quite often, the opportunity to have this kind of exchanges because we focus mostly on current affairs, which is, it's diminishing, let's say, the substance of the debate. But nevertheless, thank you again, and see you whenever you are in Greece. You are welcome here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. We will continue.
Wonderful.